Welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Thank you guys for having me.
Yeah,
Great to
thanks for
have
being
you.
here. I wanted to kick it off with what is the biggest topic of discussion over the last 2 weeks? Tariffs, H20s, NVIDIA, something else? What is driving conversations through the partners that you work with at Palantir?
I think is enterprise autonomy. It's like there's a normative view of the most valuable application of AI is clearly towards autonomy in the enterprise. And then you can think about it, you can reason about it by analogy. If you thought about the self-driving car journey, it took us 20 years to get from a prototype that drove through the desert 120 miles, pretty good demo in 2005,
Yeah.
to a commercial self-driving car service. And no one wants to be on that 20-year journey. What have we really been doing over 20 years? We've been handling edge cases, right? So really investing in the tool chain that allows you to get from a Mandralic world to one where you have AI agents that are totally automating your business. Like we've automated sepsis monitoring at Tampa General, where deaths from sepsis have reduced by half. We've automated how AIG underwrites insurance. What used to take 3 weeks and you'd only get to 10 weeks, 10% of your submissions, it takes less than an hour and you get to 100%. So I think, and it really is going to feed into this winner take most dynamic. It's not just about cost savings, it's about your competitive advantage. And you see that play out in very stark and real terms in defense, where in some sense, there's nothing new under the sun. There's just John Boyd's OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, act. Or as sometimes my favorite admiral says, the American OODA loop: observe, overreact, destroy, apologize. But how do you bring lethality to that? It's just doing it much faster, and you're going to do that way faster with AI.
That's amazing. Tyler Cowen called April 16th yesterday AGI Day. He has called it. What was your reaction to the OpenAI
Probably
news?
happened internally at Palantir months ago.
But yeah, I mean, how are you processing this idea of AGI? Obviously, it accelerates everything you're doing, but what is your take on model scaling, reasoning, agentic workflows, all these different things? Like, what are you looking for? Where are there breakthroughs that remain versus what are we just need to go implement?
Well, I think we're well past the threshold where the models are powerful enough that you can be using them to automate massive things. I think at this point, really, incremental improvements to the model changes how you decomp the problem. How many agents do you need? Do you need 80 because you've decomped it in a way where it succeeds, or do you need 8? Like the coolest stuff that I've been seeing is like multiple teams internally at Palantir are building AI FDEs. And it's really compelling. It gets really far. It attacks different parts of the stack. So like if every user could have their own on-demand, infinite, essentially, AI FDE, like how much more stuff can you build? How much more quickly can you adapt? What's your OODA loop as a company now? So I think we're deep in the implementation phase. If AI is electricity, like in electricity, all the value didn't accrete to the people who made the turbine generators. It went to the people who made the tools that ran on electricity. And I think we're just so excited about proliferating and building those tools out.
Yeah. How are you thinking about just commoditization of the model layer? Obviously, it's like a horse race. Every different month, the different models comes out. How has Palantir approached integration with different foundation models? And then is that the same as other kind of databases and different tools that might be deeper in the stack, or like even the migration to the cloud? Does this feel like cloud to you? Does this feel like mobile to you in terms of like your agnostic approach, or is it different in any way?
There are parts that definitely rhyme with it. It's more agnostic than not. I said early on in the AI revolution that we thought that the right approach was K LLMs. Like, why would you pick one LLM when you can have K? And then you really can start thinking about the tool chain that you need to build around that. There's a number of reasons. At first, like very clearly, you've had model commoditization. If you look at both open and closed models over time, the ELOs are just up and to the right. The open ones have converged and even in some cases surpassed closed models. And at the same time, the price of inference has dropped like a rock. So that's clearly happening. And you even see that in the frontier model companies where they're expanding further and further into the app stack because they realize that selling you a raw API is probably going to be a raw business.
Yeah.
So then there's a question of like, okay, you're just being very pragmatic. If you're building the machines running on this, like what model's right for what job? The models are improving rapidly. How are you going to safely be able to evaluate the relative performance of models as new models come out? So you need that sort of tool chain. And even more deliberately, these models get end of life. Like you can't get the original GPT-4 anymore, right? You have 4.0. And so if you've built an entire enterprise that runs assuming some model is going to exist in perpetuity, that's probably not going to work out that well for you. So you're going to have this constant ability to evaluate and run these models in parallel to develop the conviction you need, not only for the optimization of what's incrementally better, but can I safely migrate in the future?
How are you thinking about integrating robotics? It feels like AI today is just rapidly transforming the way work is done online, specifically knowledge work. But how are you thinking about, what's your vision 2030 and kind of beyond about, how different robotic systems are integrating with the Palantir system? Specifically, the example you mentioned earlier around sepsis monitoring is like, cool, that's one sort of hardware integration, but it's not its own autonomous, system out in the world.
In many ways, we already do this. We have like more than 300,000 workers, blue collar workers who turn wrenches in our software every day. Everything from the factory floors of Chrysler to every Airbus airframe, every HD Hyundai ship. If you think about a company like Rio Tinto, so much of the mining operation is actually autonomous. The railroad cars that take iron ore from where it's mined to the ports, that's completely autonomous. The 3-story tall dump trucks that are actually trucking out the ore, autonomous. And so I don't want to trivialize it, but in some sense, to me, it's more of like a difference of degree than kind. You're machine to machine communicating to a system. That system just happens to be smarter and smarter every single day.
During the metaverse boom, Satya Nadella was talking about building digital twins. Is that an unnecessary abstraction or like reference point for humans? Or is there some actual value in representing all of these real world assets, like the Rio Tinto mining example you gave, in some sort of like virtual space? Or does it not matter and it should all just be weights in a model that we're querying through an LLM or something like that?
Where I think it gets to be really valuable is if you kind of thought about it like a CI check in programming, where it's like, I'm proposing a change to a system here. How can I understand it? Like, is that change going to work? What are the unintended consequences of it? If I make that change, what are the new bottlenecks that different functions have to think about? The simple example I always use is the procurement guy is really excited because he bought discount raw material 30% off the list price. And the production guy is pissed off because this discount material has 40% less yield, right?
Yeah.
It is at the end of the day, one value chain. And where the digital twins have been hugely valuable is the ability to integrate the chain and the decision-making across it. So when the left hand is robbing from the right hand.
Can you talk about the early days of Palantir, maybe one of the first major wins or setbacks, or kind of like, what's the story that you tell to new Palantirians to kind of set them up for maintaining the culture? Because I feel like Palantir's done a great job of like maintaining the quality bar. You haven't become that place where people kind of go and like rest invest basically, but you are like kind of a big tech company now. What's the story that you tell to kind of set the culture?
I mean, there's so many stories. I'll tell you how I set the culture at the end, I promise. But I think one of the things that I felt like we kept getting punched in the face in the early days on is that someone else's execution would end up screwing us. Like I remember we had this gatekeeper between us and a government customer, and he installed an early version of our software, and he wanted to test it out before he passed it on, and it crashed, and he blamed us, and it crashed because, I mean, in those days, this was a server with 2 gigs of RAM, trying to run a 4 gig Java heap. And he didn't understand why it crashed, right? It's like we just developed this extreme ownership mentality because anytime we outsourced even an iota of responsibility, it blew up in our face. And you can see forward deployed engineering as like the extreme manifestation of that we're going to somehow have total control over the implementation because that's how you get the feedback and the quality and the improvement, and you're actually responsible for your own destiny. But the story I tell to kind of spill the beans on, so your first AMA with me, if you're onboarding in week 1, I always end the AMA by reminding people that Palantir is a flat place. What does flatness even mean? Well, to me, it means that every single employee is willing to tell me to fuck off to my face. And I am all say fuck off in unison out loud at the very end. I think it's important. I want to institutionalize the notion of rebellion.
Yeah.
That like, I don't have all the right ideas. There's so many things we've done over time I didn't think were going to be right, and they were right. And you got to bet on talent and the people and give them the space to run. And really preserving what's at the core of this is an artist colony, not a factory. I don't really know what your career progression is going to be, and if you want certainty on that, this is definitely not the right place. But I can promise you'll have access to the most motivating problems and compelling colleagues, and I'll give you all the canvas and paint that you need.
Yeah. Can you talk about what's going on with the cultural transformation in Washington right now. You've written like maybe it's transformation going into founder mode, but within some of the more nitty gritty, maybe swampy institutions, is there a need to be able to tell each other to F off or just be more confrontational? What should DC learn from Palantir and maybe even vice versa?
Well, I don't know if DC, I would say it seems like very presumptuous for me to say what should DC learn from Palantir.
Sure.
But what excites me about the present moment is, in Palantir terms, the primacy of winning. Like
Sure.
you feel that in the people there. They understand that they're working backwards from what could actually work instead of some anodyne notion of how we wish the world works but doesn't. And that's like allowing us to re-examine a lot of assumptions from first principles. I think founder mode is the best description of it. When I talk about conserved across commercial and government, kind of our diagnosis of the current legitimation crisis. Why do doors fall off airplanes? Why does it seem like these institutions aren't working? You have a C-suite that is, if you steel-manned it, diligently trying to steer the ship. And their steering wheel, what they don't realize, is a prop from the Jungle Cruise ride in Disneyland. It's not connected to anything. And then you have people, hardworking people on the metaphorical factory floor who kind of look up and say, how could they be so disconnected? How could they not understand what's actually happening here? And so much of that is like the levers of orientation are somehow filtered through a lot of people in the middle. Leadership doesn't have access to real-time information. If you couldn't, like if you were navigating a car and the latency of understanding where you are was an hour, you'd crash. And so like this sort of manager mode playbook, it works really well for the managers, but it's like a way of having a well-managed company into the ground.
Yeah, do you think we need more like individual champions? Peter Thiel has that quote about like we need ticker tape parades. Ezra Klein is now talking about with the abundance. He's highlighted the failure of the California high-speed rail system. And what I found interesting about that is that it's very hard to pin down like California high-speed rail. Everyone kind of agrees like the project's not going great, but no one can really say like who was even the champion of that at any point in time. Like no one's really responsible at any point in time. Does the government need more individual accountability or like I don't know, even like project level CEOs or something? I don't know.
Well, yes. The short answer to that is absolutely yes. Like I think about it in terms of heretics and heroes. It was Somerville who built the Pentagon in 16 months. It was Gene Kranz who led the Apollo program. There's something about our kind of Midwestern Calvinist sensibilities as a country where, like, it's the Apollo program and not Gene Kranz. It's the F-16 and not John Boyd's plane.
Sure.
It's the nuclear Navy, not Hyman Rickover's Navy. That's great. I appreciate that sensibility tremendously, but it shouldn't obscure the fact that actually these projects working or not come down to a handful of really exceptional individuals being present, taking ownership, and leading the way.
Yeah. Can you give me a little bit, expanding on that, can you give me a little bit of history on the $1 a year men and that story?
Yeah, in World War II, we actually had a program for very skilled people, corporate leaders, engineers. They could, for $1 a year, because volunteerism was illegal. You could not volunteer to work for the government. So as we were preparing to go to war, as we went to war, they would actually join the government as $1 a year men. They would get $1 of salary. And they would actually be able to be deployed on the nation's most important and impactful problems. And sometimes they would retain their old job. Sometimes they wouldn't. It would really depend. But you could get the right person on the job. And I think that's really important because if you think about even World War II, our mobilization came down to one man, William Knudsen, a Danish emigre who actually invented mass production. He was the number 2 at Ford, where he invented mass production. He got in a fight with Henry Ford and went to GM as the number 2. And FDR asked Bernard Barsh, who should I choose to do this? He said, I have 3 names, William Knudsen, William Knudsen, William Knudsen. It's like, it really came down to a counterfactual. We had like one guy who could actually move all of American industry. And the way that he assessed, he was an engineer himself. He would like meet people and understand, like, is it believable that you as a steering gear company can start making artillery or not? Are your engineers smart enough? Can they answer my questions? Boom, here's a contract. Let's get going. It wasn't a fiction writing contest. It was really a pressure test, mind to mind.
Interesting. Can you talk about the executive order from last week, the defense reformation? You had a great post on it, but I'd love for you to kind of break it down live for the audience.
I think it is the single biggest change that could prepare us to avoid World War III here. If you look at what has happened to the U.S. since we won the Cold War. We've really had the rise and empowerment of this monopsony, a single buyer that is the government, and an addiction to that monopsony telling us what to build, at what price, and how it's all going to work. That's very different than the free market. At some fundamental level, you either believe in the free market or you don't. And I like to quip that everyone, including the Chinese and the Russians, have given up on communism except for Cuba and the DoD. We still have 5-year plans. And this luxury of having the monopsony grow to the scale it has is the consequence of having no peer competitor. But that world really went away, arguably in 2014, the militarization of the Spratly Islands, the annexation of Crimea, Iran's pursuit of the bomb. Like, deterrence is lost, and we need to rise to that. And I think this is a clear acknowledgement of very much that in this administration. But the EO says, we prefer to buy commercial items. We prefer to buy items that have been proven in the market, that have to withstand brutal competition that happens out there every day, that reward entrepreneurs for what they're building, rather than custom building and developing things on our own. And we have a long history. A monopsony is always going to desire control. But it goes all the way back to Andrew Higgins and the boat that won the war in World War II. Andrew Higgins was a guy from Louisiana. He spent some time in China, and he was inspired by bootleggers in China and the sort of boats they had for amphibious landing to quickly land, get goods off, get goods on, and then scurry away. And at his own expense, he built the Higgins boat. And he showed up. He showed it to the Navy. The Navy wouldn't even let him compete. They kind of dismissed him. Then a young Marine who became very famous, Kralik, he got him into the competition. He won the competition, and then instead of buying the boat, the Navy stole the plans and tried to build the Higgins boat themselves, which they failed to do. And then finally, at the 11th hour, of course, we do the right thing. That's a classic American trait. And Eisenhower said that's the boat that won the war. And so, the Predator was developed as a commercial item. It was not developmentally done inside of the government. It was Abe Karim built it. General Atomics picked it up. They financed all the R&D themselves. The Air Force, of course, hated it because it was unmanned. It was kind of emasculating. And, when 9/11 happened, it was the thing that met its moment in a massive way here. And there's so many examples. Like, now we have whole companies built around this. Companies like Anduril. The entire approach is commercial first, investing private taxpayer capital into R&D, putting the pebble in the right shoe, putting the pebble in the entrepreneur's shoe rather than in the taxpayer shoe. So this EO, it's actually this law in 1994, we passed the law called the FAST, the Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act, that said it is the law that if a commercial item exists, you must buy it.
Yeah.
It's actually a very stringent test, 3-part test. So if a commercial item exists that meets your requirements, you must buy it. If it doesn't, you must see if you can change your requirement to meet the existing commercial items that do exist. And if that's not possible, you must see if you can ask the company to change their product to meet your requirement. And only then are you allowed to go custom developmental. So this is the most violated law in the land. And I think having the administration say, look, this is statute and we agree with it and we're going to enforce it is how we're going to field a huge amount of deterrence between now and 2027. There's not a lot of developmental things you can do between now and then. There's a huge amount that you can do with the innovation of entrepreneurs and the commercial industry.
That's amazing.
Do you feel like cyber warfare has been too normalized on this planet? It feels like you have a major cyber attack and maybe you hear about it on X because somebody says they can't log into Zoom or something like that, but it doesn't even make the mainstream news. Meanwhile, there's any type of sort of kinetic conflict globally, it's like immediately front page or it's on CNN, things like that. Do you think there's ever a point in the future where people start to view them and countries truly view them with the same level of significance as everything sort of continuously sort of comes online?
I think you're spot on that there's something very strange in how little we talk about it.
And, they don't photograph well.
It doesn't photograph well.
It doesn't photograph well. Like, what picture are you going to put on the front page?
But my concern is that in the future, if we have 100,000 humanoids, going around a single city and suddenly they all are stopped,
that's bad.
That will start to photograph pretty well. And so I imagine in the future, it won't be just kind of brushed under the rug. And of course, companies have to respond to it and the government responds to it. But I just imagine at some point it will start to really be news.
Well, one of the most devastating consequences of it being so kind of below the waterline, something we don't want to talk about, is the normalization of like, what can you do about it? A sort of nihilism and acceptance, a pessimism that anything can be done about it, which is obviously not the necessary precondition to like rising to the occasion. And we should have very high standards for what can be done about it. Not this, of course, this company got breached or this thing happened and all these people have my information, all the way to, sure, our water systems are compromised and, we'll be brought to our knees within the first few days of conflict. Like we're not able to hold ourselves to the high bar that we ought to, because it's not popular and we're not popularizing it as a concept.
I mean, speaking of popularizing, just general shifts in thought about defense and the importance of like public-private partnerships in the government. Can you take us through the Defense Reformation, 18 Theses, your thesis there, and then kind of the impact and is it a jobs not finished situation, or has defense tech become enough of a meme now? It seems like Silicon Valley is like fully on board, in my opinion, but at the same time, there's a lot more that we could do.
Yeah, I think we've earned the right to have an at bat.
Sure.
So like we've got to perform now for sure. I'd say the fuller I've touched on some of the themes, but the fuller diagnostic is the government has kind of historically made it a bad business to work with the government. And you think about like our examples from the past, like at Intel, Bob Noyce would not let more than 4% of his R&D budget come from the government because he, as the inventor of the transistor, wanted engineering control over the roadmap and what he was going to build. He always had in mind a broader commercial market that was going to drive the price performance that was needed. Even though in 1969, something like 96% of his revenue came from the Apollo program and DoD. At that point, they looked like a government contractor, but that was not his aspiration was bigger. In the same way that Elon Musk's aspiration for SpaceX has always been to get to Mars and to make us an interplanetary species. It's not just about launching rockets and satellites into orbit here. And we really lost, so much of defense innovation. Kelly Johnson, who built 40 plus airframes in his career, including the U-2, which we still fly, and the SR-71. He is this heroic figure. So much of this innovation has come from these legendary engineers, these heretics, as I call it. Today, you think about it as Northrop Grumman, but it was Jack Northrop and Leroy Grumman. It was not Lockheed Martin, it was the Lockheed brothers, and it was Glenn Martin. And it was really so founder driven. The aerospace industry subsidized its own existence in the interwar period between World War I and World War II because the government didn't think it needed it. So, but for private industry being willing to lose money for a decade plus, World War II, we would have been in a very, very bad place. And what excites, so I think The Last Supper, people look at The Last Supper, which is this dinner at the Pentagon in 1993, where they said, hey, look, we have 51 primes today. You guys are not all going to survive. Today we have 5. For every dollar we were spending in defense, we started spending only 33 cents overnight. It was a huge cut, the peace dividend, as it's called. Yeah. Consequence that conventional people take away from this is, oh, that's when we lost competition. We went from 51 down to 5. I don't think that was the actual issue. The real issue is that consolidation bred conformity, and the conformity pushed out all of the heretics. It pushed out all of the founder personalities that you need to make this stuff really work. My reason for immense optimism in this moment is that the founders are back. More than $100 billion have been deployed in the national interest. You have Palmer Luckey, you have the Sang brothers at Shield AI, you have Dino and Saronic, you have all these crews of really, really compelling humans, really, really compelling founders working in the national interest, again, pursuing heretical ideas, waking up every day, banging their head against the wall, fighting the bureaucracy to do what's right for the men and women in uniform and for the nation more broadly.
Can you talk a little bit about the startups that are building on top of Palantir and take us through AIP?
Yeah, so we've always, it's a little abstract, but I've always felt like the ontology, which is our secret sauce, it's really, you can think about it as like a declarative backend. It's a way of saying, look, this is the shape of not only my data, but the logic of my enterprise. And that's all you have to do, as opposed to the imperative approach of having to actually go create and wire this up and do it together and figure out how to get it to scale. And so if you had this declarative backend, if you could just say, look, this is what I need to exist in the world, now I can build applications on top of that manage and all of the entropy that usually sits behind it. And it gives you a radical speed advantage for these companies. So these companies are building everything from like the European Cricket Network to people who are building pharma companies, hospital operations companies. In defense, it's very popular because we can give you an SDK that wires you into 20 years of data that has been integrated into the instances of Palantir that exist in the defense community that your users can authenticate to. So it just speeds a lot of the kind of brain damage you would get from having to deal with the bureaucracy, and allows you to compete on the quality of your product rather than your game and getting through the wickets of a Byzantine process that probably needs its own reformation. But it's really about speed. And that ability to build on top of the platform, it's not just for third-party developers. When Hurricane Helene happened in North Carolina, green suiters, like folks in the Army in the 101st, built their own they built their own hurricane common operating picture on top of the platform. So that ability to respond to the need, it's the code version of the OODA loop.
Yeah.
What advice would you give somebody maybe graduating college today that's evaluating joining, maybe a seed stage company versus a scaled company like Palantir or something like an Anduril? I imagine you at times had a ton of different pressure from VCs being like, leave, we'll give you 10 million bucks to do whatever you want. Like, don't you want to be a founder? Yet when I look at opportunities, in anything defense related, it seems like if you have a founder mindset, there's so many great opportunities to just go to a great company and kind of take on that sort of like founder level ownership over a specific problem area or product set or things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think of course, I'm biased here, but if I would give general advice, the way I would think about it, what I would tell my son is like, where can you go that you're going to work with the most compelling people? Because like your rate of learning is going to be a function of those people, and have access to the greatest surface area around problems. Like my model for growth is not progressive overload. The Incredible Hulk did not become incredible by just lifting a little bit more weight every single day. It's like a near fatal dose of gamma rays that probably has like a 50% chance of killing you. So which companies are going to like throw you off the deep end and give you that opportunity to have like superhuman, superhero growth? That's the value maximizing thing. And I would remind my son that like your point of extreme growth is going to be coincident with your point of maximal pain. So like your ability, like, it's like, as Greg LeMond says, one of my favorite quotes, championship cyclists, it doesn't get easier. You just go faster. And just understanding that like that's what it looks like. So don't sell out for the opioid of a linear career progression with a clearly mapped out path. I'm pretty sure that's retarding. Like that's lead shielding that's preventing the real gamma rays from getting to you here. Find places you can throw yourself off the deep end. And I bet there are some seed stage companies that are perfect for that. I bet there's some seed companies that are horrible for that. It really is pretty specific.
Does that tie to the primacy of winning mentality? Is that like is that essentially like derivative or like the same concept?
Yeah, I think it very much relates to that. And I think it's like one of the things that I feel like it's one of the most important things I learned at Palantir. We're all kind of programmed in our conventional education to feel like there's a process, there's an approach.
Yes.
If you follow the playbook, you'll win. But it's actually like it starts to conform to how you wish the world would work. It becomes hard to decide, is that actually the cargo cult, or is that how the world does work? Like you can keep marching around these fields in Micronesia, the planes aren't coming back. You've misunderstood the physics of the universe here. And just if you just anchor yourself like, but is this working? Like, is it winning? And then blow up anything that's not working.
Okay, last question on cargo culting. Cargo culting the forward deployed engineer, good or bad? When does it work? When does it not work? Who should be doing it?
Well, I think all cargo culting is bad. So I think that would be, it's I think the forward deployed engineering methodology is exceptionally valuable. Akshay's description of it is the best one. I think it's like solving through back propagation. It's a very elegant metaphor. But if you just slap a veneer on it where it's like sales engineering done. It's my favorite things, like ex-Palantirans will be like, people are asking me like, what is an echo? And I'll describe an echo and they'll be like, so you mean customer support, customer success? And it's like, wow, you've lost the essence of this whole thing, this beautiful concept. You've completely cargo culted away.
Oh no. Well, thank you so much for stopping by. This is a fantastic interview.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, this is great. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll talk to you soon.
Cheers.
Bye.